Hello, I'm Claire Morgan of the Times Square Alliance, and as you all can see, the ball has stopped halfway to its perch. It's suspended there to remind us before we pop the champagne and celebrate the new year to stop and reflect on the year that has gone by, to remember both our triumphs and our missteps, our promises made and broken, the times we opened ourselves up to great adventures or closed ourselves down for fear of getting hurt. Because that's what New Year's is all about. Getting another chance. A chance to forgive. To do better, to do more, to give more, to love more. And to stop worrying about what if and start embracing what will be. So when that ball drops at midnight, and it will drop, let's remember to be nice to each other, kind to each other. And not just tonight, but all year long. Thank you.
I love that clip because it reaffirms that every New Year's Eve is really an opportunity to look back on the last 365 days so that we can rejoice over our gains and grieve over our losses. And it's not like everything resets tomorrow on January 1st, but the New Year's can act like a marker whereby we do our best to let the lessons that we experience from the previous year prepare us for whatever adventure God has for us in the following year. And so before we begin the message today, I'd like us all to take a few moments, reflect back on the good, the bad, and the ugly of this past year. What worked and didn't work for you in 2017? Just think about that for a moment. What gains or losses came into your life? What do you feel really good about, and what do you regret? What would you like to see increase, and what would you like to see decrease? We already heard from Megan about her prayer. What about you? What brought you great joy, and what brought you great sorrow this past year? And whatever thoughts popped into your mind about this past year, tomorrow starts a brand new year. Full of opportunity, full of potential, and full of new adventures. So why don't we embrace it as if we're turning a page of a new chapter in an exciting novel that we're reading. This evening at midnight begins a brand new year. Most of us love new things. I think you all probably love new things. We love wearing new clothes, new jewelry. We dream about one day buying a new car or a new home. Some of us even hang a new car air freshener on our rearview mirrors. We love listening to new music and watching new movies. And if we're single, we can't wait till we find a new partner in our lives. But do you know God loves new things too? He loves new things. I'm calling this New Year's Eve message, What's New in the Bible? Not because I uncovered something new in the ancient writings, but because of how often the word new shows up in our Bibles. It shows up over 200 times. And most of the time, new is used grammatically as an adjective to help describe the timing of the noun that it's modifying. In other words, the object that new is modifying hasn't yet existed, hasn't yet appeared, hasn't been done previously. Is this not working? It's being wonky? Wonky. hard to keep up with new words. Wonky. New words. Okay. It's an adjective. So it hasn't yet appeared, hasn't shown up. I've mentioned this in the past to many people's dismay, I might add. But one of the things I often do before I read a new novel is I immediately fast forward to the end of the book to make sure that it's going to end the way I like, okay? I'm what you're called a self-spoiler. But it really works for me because I typically finish all the novels that I start reading. And so, of course, when I first became a follower of Yeshua 35 years ago, I immediately fast-forwarded to the end of God's story to see how it ended, and I was absolutely delighted by what I discovered. So here's a spoiler. Here's a spoiler alert. If you've never read to the end of God's story, you don't want to know how it ends, this would be a good time to get up and go start the New Year celebrations right now, okay? But here's what I discovered. Revelation chapter 21, verse 1 through 6. Let's read it together. I got them on the screen here. And let's see what God is doing new. All right, let's read together. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be their God." This is God's end goal, by the way, to establish an eternal family where he is at the center and we are all around him. You've heard me teach on this before. Okay, let's go on. And this is what he'll do. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And here's the one I love right here, this next one. He who is seated on the throne said, and by the way, this is God, "I am making everything new." And then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." Now, listen to this and just let this passage soak in. One day in the future, God is going to make everything new. Everything. That includes you as well, okay? It turns out that at the end of God's story is actually is a new beginning for everything and everyone, where there'll be no more injustice or inequality ever again. God's ultimate plan is to make everything new. But until that time arrives, God does many awesome new things throughout history to make our experience here on earth more meaningful and gratifying, despite any challenging seasons that might enter into our lives or into this world. Can't think of a better time to examine a few of these awesome new things than in a message on New Year's Eve day. So, because of time, I'm only going to cover 4 of them this morning, but each of these could easily be a full message on its own, and maybe we'll do that later in this year. We'll do a full message. But I think you're going to find that doing these 4 collectively in one message, I hope, is going to be a powerful encouragement, motivation for you to start off this new year tomorrow. Before I begin, I want to read you the longer list, though. Okay? It's not the exhaustive list, but it's pretty thorough here. So here they are. Things that God does new throughout history. New song. I love this one. New wine. New moon. New covenant. New mercies. New spirit, new heart, new command, new creation, new life, new man, new self, new birth, new name, new heaven, new earth, new Jerusalem, and eventually a new everything. Is that cool or what? Wouldn't it be fun to do a whole series on that? It'd be a new series for sure. Okay, let's look at the four of the new things from this list. Okay, and the first one is that God gives us a new song. I love this one. Psalm 40, verse 3, King David says, "God put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. And God's intent by putting a new song in our mouths is that we would experience more joy in our lives. Now, my lovely wife, Andrea, who's sitting right there, she exercises almost daily. She has a spin bike in her art gallery, and while she's spinning on her bike, she's usually listening to loud praise music and singing out very loudly and very off-key. Okay. You know the phrase, sing like no one's watching or listening? All right, that's Andrea. But bless her heart, because Andrea sings out of the joy that God has put in her heart, even during challenging seasons of life. And the people who know her often comment on this about her. My wife is a serious person of faith in all seasons of life. Not super spiritual, just trusting God in all seasons. And that produces joy. As Nehemiah 8:10 says, the joy of the Lord is Andrea's strength. Because many years ago, God put a new song in her. And trust me, you wouldn't like the old song that either of us used to sing years ago, okay? It was a bad song. Notice how this verse ends by saying that because of this new song that we sing, many will put their trust in God. Now listen, one of the most perplexing things to me when I first became a follower of Yeshua 35 years ago was how stuffy and how boring and how uptight many Christians were. You know, and as a Jew who comes from a rich, joyful, celebrative, spiritual background, when almost every holiday festival has plenty of joyful, upbeat singing and dancing and lots of great food and plenty of wine, and since Christianity's roots are Jewish, I often thought to myself in those early years, what happened to you guys? Who got to you? Who stole away your joy? And when in history did you all become such prudes? That kind of faith is not a new song about liberty and deliverance. It's an old song about bondage and oppression. And what I love so much about our faith community here at Cornerstone is that we've restored liberating joy and unapologetic fun back into our sacred practices. And when people hear us singing this new song, they're drawn to God. They're drawn to a God who would produce such joy and fun in the people who follow him. And so this next year, let's sing even more like no one is watching, but let's be smart enough to know they are watching. And what they need to see is the joy of the Lord welling up in us because of what he has done and what he's doing through all the seasons of our life. Okay, the next new thing God does is to give us a new heart and a new spirit. Ezekiel 36:26. God says, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone, and I'll give you a heart of flesh. This is about being less religious and more spiritual. This is actually one of the phrases that you hear often here in Boulder when you talk to people about God. They'll say, well, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And typically, the general Christian community makes fun of Boulderites for saying this phrase because they think it's nothing but, well, New Age gibberish. But this is really a great phrase, and one that you and I it should be coming from us, you know? The heart of stone in this passage refers to a hard, calloused heart that's both legalistic and hypocritical at the same time. People with this kind of heart are quick to set really high and rigid standards for everyone to live by, but they're just as quick not to live up to those same standards themselves, mainly because they're impossible standards for anyone to live up to. Jesus often rebuked these kinds of people, and he called them names like hypocrites and blind guides and whitewashed tombs who try to look all perfect and clean on the outside and were really full of death and decay on the inside. And people of faith like this are religious. They're not spiritual because they try to force themselves and others to follow the letter of the Torah, the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. But this was never God's intent. Ever. So he says, I'm going to do something about your hard, callous hearts. I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to put a new spirit in you. I'm going to make you less religious, but more spiritual. That's what I'm going to do. One of the educational tracks that we repeat here at Cornerstone often is called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. It's built on the premise that it's impossible to be spiritually healthy if you're not emotionally healthy. And when we first did this track several years ago, a few people actually ended up leaving the church because they felt like it was, well, New Age gibberish. Does that sound familiar? But not only is EHS solid biblical material, but every one of those who left Cornerstone because of this series are the very people who would have benefited from it. The Torah was never meant to be used as a rigid set of legalistic rules. It was meant to establish a radical framework on how to love God and love others in radical ways. Jesus reinforced this radical framework when he said in John 13:34, a new command, there's another one, right? A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. This command is meant to make love the highest goal in everything we do, which was not new by any means, right? But in the face of the prevailing hypocrisy and legalism that permeated much of rabbinic teaching in the first century, this command had to feel like a breath of fresh air to his disciples, to those who heard it. So in 2018, let's love God. Let's love others through the Spirit, not the law, not the letter of the law. Let's be quick to admit that we fall just as short doing this as everyone else on this planet. Let's not be judgmental. Let's not be intolerant. Let's strive to make love the ultimate goal in everything that we do in our homes, in our workplaces, in our social media platforms, in our politics, especially everywhere. Let's be less religious, but more spiritual. Does that make sense to anybody? All right. I saw two heads nod. It's perfect. That's twice as many as last week. All right. I'm on a roll here. All right, the next thing God does is to give us new birth. 1 Peter chapter 1, 3-4 says, Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord, Messiah Yeshua. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead and into an inheritance that can never, never, never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you. New birth is about living each day like we're going to live forever. Now, before I jump into this topic, I want to give a quick disclaimer. I'm all about working daily on our physical, spiritual, and emotional health. I'm all about this, okay? So that we can be everything God wants us to be during the time that we're here on earth. We should be eating healthy foods, exercising regularly, spending time with God through a variety of spiritual disciplines. Whatever works for you to get you closer and more intimate with God, do those spiritual disciplines. There's not a one-size-fits-all. We should be continually putting ourselves in environments that facilitate transformation. We should be saving money for a rainy day, keeping our cupboards stocked with food. But there's this line that we can cross in all of these areas where the amount of attention that we give to self-preservation chokes out our ability to live life as the exciting adventure God meant it to be. You and I are all embedded in an exciting grand story written by God himself, and we all have a role to play in the story, but many of us miss it because we become too self-focused. Now, I know all of you have probably experienced this, but you know when you go to a sporting event, particularly at a big stadium, and people start getting a little bored about what's happening on the field, so somebody starts a wave. It's really fun because, particularly if it's in a big stadium, because you can see this wave moving across the stadium, and it's slowly making its way to you, and you're just sitting there in anticipation for your grand moment. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, woo! And it's here and it's gone in a second, in a flash. And if you reached to take a bite out of your peanuts and Cracker Jacks, you would have missed it. That's how God's story is. So many people today live in such perpetual fear of the future that when God's story, you know, when you're born, that's your role in God's story. It's been taking place for a long time, but you have like 60 to 110 years, whatever amount of years you end up living, to play your role in the story. But so many people miss out on this exciting role that God has for them because they're too distracted trying to preserve their own lives. Listen, if you are a person of faith, then you have been born anew into an eternal inheritance that can never, ever, ever, ever perish, spoil, or fade. It's being kept in heaven for you. It's like a reservation got called in. It's been paid for. It can never be canceled. Your name is on the roster. You're going to live forever. And nothing that happens to you in this lifetime can change that reality. Nothing. So in that sense, we're all bulletproof. We're all superhuman. We're all faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. One of my favorite lines from a song comes from one that was written in 1978 by a radical hippie believer named Keith Green. How many know Keith Green? If you're too young, go on YouTube. He's got amazing, in-your-face, awesome music, okay? The song is called Asleep in the Light, and it's written to believers who are like in the light, but they're like falling asleep. They're in their beds. Nice, safe, and secure in their beds. And it's a song, really, in his own words. It's not in Gene Binder's meta-narrative kind of words, but in Keith Green's meta-narrative kind of words. It's a song about encouraging everyone to wake up to the unique role that God has written for them in his story. And Keith Green was a real passionate, in-your-face kind of songwriter. And my favorite line from that song says this. It says, Jesus rose from the grave, but you can't even get out of bed. And I love it. And what I like about this line is that the contrast that it paints is between Jesus being right there at the climax of all the drama of God's story, while many of us miss the drama completely because we're stuck in the safety and security of our beds, metaphorically speaking, right? We think it's safe. We think we're safe. There's no place. There's no safe place. Well, faith is your safe place. Many years ago, when we first got here, Andrew and I would take in one college student at a time from CU. And they would live with us for the 4 years that they were students at CU. Really awesome thing to do. And we had many. We had several, probably 4 or 5 students over the course of, 16 years or so. And one of those students was named Thomas Loudon. Anybody remember Thomas? Some of you were here when he came. And Thomas was at CU on a naval ROTC scholarship. And while Thomas lived with us, he tried out and was successful as a walk-on the CU football team under the coaching leadership of Rick Neuheisel. And walk-ons typically don't get into the game much, if any. And Thomas sat faithfully week after week after week on the bench with no playtime. Suited up, ready to go, no playtime. When Gary Barnett took over as coach in Thomas's last year at CU, Thomas had some new hope that he might get a chance to play, but Coach Barnett continued to have him sit on the bench on the sidelines week after week. But then, in the last day of the last game in Thomas's last year at CU, Coach Barnett looked at Thomas, not the last game, the last play of the last game. Coach, yeah, it's got down to that. Like, Coach Barnett looked at Thomas and said, "Get in the game." And trust me, you've never seen a more excited young man hustle onto the field. So Thomas graduated a few months later, and after his graduation ceremony, many of Thomas's friends and family, including Andrea and myself, gathered in someone's home to honor his academic accomplishments. He was a very unique, humble, passionate young man, kind of guy you just want to be like your best friend. But Thomas turned the whole event upside down when he stopped the celebration, and he began to honor everyone in that room who had come to honor him. And he thanked us all for our love and our support over the 4 years that he was at school. But then he said something none of us who were there will ever forget. He said, as a future naval officer, and he's a commander today in the Naval Air Force, he said, "I will lay down my life to protect our country, especially those of you who are here in this room right now. I will die for all of you." And if you know Thomas, you know that he meant it, and we all cried. I mean, the whole room cried. Thomas has been in the game ever since, faithfully serving in the Naval Air Force as a career officer for the last 18 years. He married Christy Rexford, who they met here at Cornerstone when they both attended going to college. They have 2 children. They're currently living in Colorado Springs, but they've been all around the world. Thomas used to fly missions from Japan to Iraq. Now I can say that because I couldn't say it back then. And a big booyah. Oh, and they attend CU football games as often as they can. So big booyah, shout out to the Loudon family. And what an inspiration you are to all of us. It's never too late to get into the game. You're never too young, and you're never too old. And the best part is that you have nothing to lose. You have everything to gain. And so let's live each day next year as if we're going to be living forever, because we are. Wake up. Get out of bed. Get into the game, because there's an exciting, bold journey awaiting for all of us. Okay, the last new thing I want to cover is how God makes a new covenant. On this last night with his disciples, during a Passover Seder, Jesus picked up the unleavened bread and the cup of wine used in a Seder. And Luke 22:19-20 tells us that he took the bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he gave it to them, his disciples, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. And the worship team can start making its way back up here. A few weeks ago, at the beginning of our Element series, Brian did a message on what covenant means. And he said that covenant is always about God moving toward people and speaking to them because he wants to send them in a new direction. And so when Jesus says that his blood is the new covenant that he's making with us, we know that his intent is to move us in a brand new direction. And that direction is to move us into a more intimate and committed relationship with God, and into a more intimate and committed relationship with each other. And Jesus made this possible by breaking his body and shedding his blood for us. Covenant is about intimacy and commitment. And we find this in the scriptures that Jesus' death and resurrection broke down all the barriers and all the obstacles that distance us from God and from each other. There's nothing hindering us in each of those relationships. And as a covenant faith community here at Cornerstone, we highly value the commitment that we have to each other to be on a shared journey of faith together. We know how important it is to have people in our lives who encourage us in a non-judgmental, supportive way when we're struggling with things like selfishness or doubt in our faith. We're trying to figure out, what is my purpose in this life? What is my role in this crazy story? And there's a tendency these days to have a lower value on community. Lots of churches today don't even try, and they focus solely on Sunday morning as the primary gathering. There's no attempt to create intimacy and support through community outside of Sunday. That trend today is to attend church less, to avoid being part of a smaller, more intimate and supportive group, to give less of your time, to give less of your money for the common good of humanity. And listen to this. God predicted this time in the Bible. In Hebrews 10:24 and 25, it says, "Let us consider how we might spur one another." That word spur literally means to provoke, like to poke somebody with a stick. So let us consider how we might poke them with a stick, right? To love one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. That day approaching is referring to the end of God's story, also called the last days. And the writer of Hebrew is telling us, don't be part of the trend to be less committed. In fact, as we get closer into the story, be even more committed. Don't get sucked into that crowd that is moving away from community. Push further into it, because you're going to need it. And so in 2018, let's be more committed to God. Let's be more committed to each other. Let's attend more. Let's give more. And most of all, let's love more the way Jesus loved us sacrificially. So here's our picture of sacrifice right here. The communion elements. Communion. Common union. That is why we're here. We have this common union together. Community. All comes from the same words. It's the new covenant. God moving us in a new direction. Away from isolation. Toward community. So, maybe we have the ushers come up and kind of get these prepared. Everybody is welcome to participate in communion. We practice an open communion. There's no restrictions at all, other than that you just recognize that this is the body and blood of Jesus. In the same regard, you're welcome not to come up. Please don't feel pressure. But however God's moving in you, use this time as a way to reflect on the past year look forward to the next year. So let's stand up together and let me pray.